52 BC. The September wind carries the scent of smoke and despair over the wooden fortifications. Vercingetorix, the supreme chieftain of the Gauls, dons his finest ceremonial armor. He slowly rides out through the gates of besieged Alesia, completely alone. The chieftain silently throws his sword at the feet of Gaius Julius Caesar, who is seated. Behind him, inside the fortress, 80,000 exhausted warriors await their fate. The Roman commander sits on a high wooden platform. He utters not a single word of triumph or schadenfreude. Caesar merely points coldly at his armed lictors. The proud Gallic king is instantly shackled in heavy iron chains. At that very moment, the long and bloody Gallic War officially comes to an end. Most history textbooks end their accounts right at this dramatic moment. We're told about the ingenious siege and the double ring of Roman wars. But historians often overlook the darkest and most pragmatic aspect of this victory. What exactly does an army do with 80,000 prisoners who outnumber its own troops? The reality turned out to be far more cynical and complex than a simple mass execution. We'll take a detailed look at one of the most massive logistical operations of antiquity. You'll see how the Roman war machine turned human lives into pure profit. We'll trace the exact fate of every social group trapped in this mountain fortress. It was a grandiose business scheme that literally brought the global economy of the time to its knees. Caesar pulled off a financial operation of unprecedented scale, and it was precisely this money that forever changed the course of European history. Alesia was an impregnable city perched atop a massive hill. Caesar built 11 miles of intricate fortifications around this mountain. Then he erected another 14 miles of walls facing outward to guard against reinforcements. He trapped 80,000 soldiers and thousands of civilians in a gigantic trap. The Romans created the perfect cage, designed to wear down the enemy through mass attrition. Gaius Julius Caesar was deeply in debt at the time. He owed millions of sesterces to his political allies in Rome. He needed more than just a glorious military victory for prestige. The general needed a huge amount of cash to physically survive in politics. The siege of Alesia became his main and riskiest financial gamble. In their camps, the Roman legionaries behaved like highly disciplined professionals. They woke up on schedule, cleaned their weapons, and cooked their standard wheat porridge. The soldiers calmly watched the starving Gauls from behind their safe wooden palisades. For them, this siege had become a boring but predictable daily routine. The Roman army was generally adept at turning war into systematic, routine work. This provided the soldiers with psychological support amid constant danger. The Gauls had food supplies sufficient for a maximum of 30 days of severe rationing, but they had brought their families and local Mandabian residents with them into the fortress. Vercingetorix was forced to make a mathematical decision that was monstrous in its cruelty. He ordered all civilians to leave the fortress immediately. The chieftain sincerely believed that the Romans would let women and the elderly pass through their lines, but Caesar gave the legions strict orders to keep the gates tightly shut. The Roman soldiers simply stood on the walls and looked down in silence. Thousands of women and children found themselves trapped in a narrow strip between the two armies. They slowly died of thirst and hunger before their husbands' eyes. It was psychological warfare at the absolute height of its cruelty. Not a single commander wavered or disobeyed this order. The legions simply maintained their formation and methodically awaited the outcome. It was precisely this ruthless patience that finally broke the Gallic resistance. Surrender was not an act of cowardice, but a mathematical inevitability. Roman engineering simply left them no physical chance of survival. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. 80,000 men simultaneously laid down their arms and became prisoners of war. It sounds like an organizational nightmare for any army in the world. How is it even possible to control a mass of people that outnumbers the guards? The answer lies in the incredible discipline and architectural skills of the Roman engineers. They transformed their siege camps into impregnable sorting centers. Gaius Trebonius, one of Caesar's finest legates, was in charge of constructing the fortifications. His soldiers dug 20-foot deep moats and filled them with water. They installed thousands of wooden stakes, affectionately known as Roman lilies. These hidden traps pierced the legs of anyone who tried to escape or attack. Modern minefields operate on exactly the same psychological principle. Only the Romans made their mines from sharpened oak trunks. It is impossible to control a huge crowd of prisoners without strictly segmenting the space. Caesar ordered the Gauls to be immediately divided into small, isolated groups. They were placed in special temporary pens inside the outer ring of fortifications. Guards on the perimeter rotated strictly on a schedule to maintain vigilance. Roman commanders understood perfectly well that a tired guard makes fatal mistakes. Military tribune Mark Antony personally oversaw the distribution of rations among the prisoners. The Gauls were given just enough water and grain to keep them from dying. An emaciated person is physically incapable of mounting a rebellion against armed guards. This was a cruel but incredibly effective tactic for crushing the will to resist. Your office job may seem exhausting, but it doesn't involve fighting for a sip of water. The Romans used starvation as their most reliable tool for crowd control. At that moment, the famous Roman bureaucracy was on full display. Caesar's scribes began meticulously recording and classifying every captured warrior. They documented the prisoner's tribal affiliation, age, physical condition, and status. It was a massive inventory of living property right on the field of the recent battle. The ancient Romans kept records with the precision of modern logistics companies. During this sorting process, a very important political maneuver took place. Caesar ordered that warriors from the Aedui and Arverni tribes be separated from the rest. About 20,000 people from these key tribes received an unexpected amnesty. The commander sent them home to restore loyalty in these strategically important regions. It was a brilliant diplomatic move that prevented future guerrilla wars. Rome triumphed not only by the sword, but also through brilliant political calculation. The remaining 60,000 Gauls lost all their rights and hopes for freedom. Under Roman law, a prisoner of war was officially stripped of his status as a human being. He became a talking weapon that could be sold, exchanged, or killed. Soldiers took from them their last pieces of jewelry, warm cloaks, and family talismans. Standing in the cold autumn wind were no longer proud Celtic warriors. They were simply valuable commodities awaiting transport to the markets. An ordinary Roman legionary suddenly became a wealthy man. Under the terms of the surrender, every soldier in Caesar's army received one slave. The army numbered about 40,000 legionaries, and each received a personal trophy. This was a powerful motivational tool that guaranteed the troops' loyalty to their commander. Today, companies award their top employees annual bonuses in the form of stock. Caesar awarded his generous bonuses in the form of living people, but an ordinary legionary couldn't drag a slave along with him during long marches. He needed to quickly convert this living prize into hard cash. That's why the Roman army was always followed by a huge trail of merchants and slave traders. These vultures of war bought prisoners from the soldiers at heavily discounted prices. The legionnaires happily sold the Gauls for silver, which easily fit into their pouches. Merchants reaped enormous profits by organizing bulk shipments of slaves to the south. This system functioned as a perfect conveyor belt of death and incredible enrichment. The army seized territory, crushed resistance, and generated a primary human resource. And private business transformed this resource into a steady stream of income. Now consider the fate of those who stood at the top of this food chain. The fate of the supreme chieftains differed radically from that of ordinary warriors. The Romans did not sell enemy kings at ordinary slave markets. Vercingetorix represented too valuable a political asset for such a trivial fate. He was sent to Rome under heavy guard by elite legionaries. The chieftain was to be the centerpiece of Julius Caesar's future triumph. The Gallic leader's journey to the capital of the empire was fraught with endless humiliations. he was transported in a sturdy wooden cage on full display for all to see. The man who, until recently, had commanded a vast army now subsisted on scraps. The escort soldiers regularly reminded him of his new, insignificant status. Psychological pressure was an integral part of the Roman protocol for dealing with prisoners. The enemy was to arrive in Rome completely broken from within. Upon his arrival in Rome, Vercingetorix was immediately thrown into the Mamertine prison. It was a dreadful underground dungeon right at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. The lower level of this prison was called the Tullianum, and it could only be accessed through a narrow hole in the ceiling. In the cramped, damp, windowless cell, there was neither a bed nor a proper toilet. The ancient historian Sallust described this place as a revolting pit, full of darkness and an unbearable stench. Modern maximum security prisons would seem like luxury resorts compared to this damp stone tomb. The Romans had no concept of humane treatment for war criminals. For them, imprisonment was not a punishment. It served merely as a waiting room before inevitable death. The dampness from the great cloaca running nearby seeped right through the cold stone walls. The Gallic kings spent nearly 6 long years in this foul-smelling stone pit. It sounds physically impossible, doesn't it? But the guards took great care to ensure that their valuable prisoner did not die of exhaustion before his time. Why did Caesar make his arch-enemy wait so unbearably long for his execution? The fact is that a triumph could only be held after the military campaign had been fully concluded. And while the general was crushing the last pockets of resistance, such as the fortress of Uxellodunum in 51, his greatest trophy was rotting in a dungeon. Vercingetorix became a hostage to a packed political schedule and the looming civil war. Guards methodically lowered meager meals to him on a rope through the only opening in the ceiling. The prisoner slowly but surely lost his mind in conditions of complete darkness and informational isolation. But here's what's truly astonishing about this system. The Romans did not subject the Gallic chieftain to any physical torture during his many years of imprisonment. There was simply no practical need or sadistic purpose for it. Sensory deprivation and the complete absence of hope broke his psyche far more effectively than red-hot iron. Today, intelligence agencies use similar white noise methods to disorient prisoners. Ancient Rome achieved the same result with the help of a simple stone pit and absolute silence. Other high-ranking Gallic commanders faced a fate no less tragic, but far more swift. Those who were of no great triumphal value to Caesar were ruthlessly executed right at the site of the surrender. Roman lictors used their traditional fasces, bundles of birch rods with axes woven into them, for this purpose. First, the condemned aristocrat was brutally flogged with rods right in front of the silent ranks of legionaries. Then, an experienced executioner severed his head with a single swift and supremely precise blow from a heavy axe. Roman field justice always operated without sentimentality or lengthy legal proceedings. And this bloody procedure was not merely blind revenge on the part of the exultant victors. The execution of the chieftains held a profound sacred and strictly political significance for the entire Roman army. Legate Titus Labienus, Caesar's right-hand man at the time, was personally present as the sentences were carried out. He methodically recorded the death of each commander, crossing their names off his wax tablets. This vividly demonstrated to the ordinary Gallic prisoners that their old hereditary elite no longer physically existed. Modern corporations dismiss their entire top management in a similar manner during an aggressive hostile takeover. The Romans deliberately and methodically destroyed any structure of authority within the conquered Celtic tribes. A crowd without its legitimate leaders instantly loses the ability to mount organized resistance. The Druid priests, who preserved the people's oral history, were the first to be eliminated by Roman soldiers. The legionnaires understood perfectly well that an ideological threat was more dangerous than any iron weapon. A decapitated people is much easier to turn into a frightened and obedient labor force. Now imagine how the surviving noble captives reacted to this. Some of the surviving Gallic aristocrats, in a panic, tried to buy their lives with glittering gold. They secretly offered Roman centurions the hidden treasures of their distant ancestors and generous ransoms. In any other ancient army, this would have worked without fail. But Gaius Julius Caesar categorically forbade his officers from accepting such private bribes from the vanquished. All the immense wealth of conquered Gaul now officially and exclusively belonged to the Roman Republic. The commander personally monitored every gram of captured precious metal through his trusted quaestors. The punishment for violating this order was truly terrifying. For the illegal appropriation of even the smallest trophy, a centurion could easily pay with his own head. Special military auditors searched the legionnaires' tents with the meticulousness of modern tax inspectors. If a soldier was found to have unreported Celtic gold, he faced trial and the shameful execution known as the fustiarium. His comrades in arms would beat the thief to death with clubs right in front of the entire legion lined up in formation. The Romans enforced discipline in the distribution of spoils more strictly than in the bloodiest close combat. The weapons of the defeated elite were also subjected to incredibly thorough accounting and systematic destruction. Luxurious iron helmets, adorned with raven feathers and gold inlay, were immediately sent to be melted down. The famous golden torques were flattened with heavy blacksmith's hammers right before the eyes of the captive crowd. Long, high-quality Celtic swords were methodically broken in half on special, massive wooden blocks. This was an act of the deepest symbolic humiliation and complete destruction of the ancient warrior caste. For a Celtic man, losing his personal weapon meant losing his masculine honor forever. And this is where Rome's logistics revealed themselves in all their cynical glory. The legion's field blacksmiths worked around the clock, transforming Gaul's cultural heritage into standardized ingots. The Roman economy had no tolerance for individuality or barbarian art within its strict financial system. The metal was quickly standardized, weighed, and sent in guarded wagons straight to the capital. It resembled the operation of a giant recycling plant, processing someone else's history into hard currency. The infrastructure of war devoured luxury items faster than they had time to cool. As a result, virtually nothing material remained of the vast and wealthy Gallic civilization. Chiefs were held in underground cells, swords were melted down into ingots, and horses were reduced to ordinary draft animals. The Roman war machine proved that it was capable not only of destruction, but also of assimilating resources with maximum efficiency. Every person, every gram of metal, and every animal was assigned an inventory number and a strict price. It was a triumph of bureaucracy over the freedom-loving and chaotic spirit of the barbarians. But this is where things get most interesting for those who found themselves at the very bottom of this ruthless food chain. Thus, the elite of a vast nation were wiped off the face of the earth in a matter of days. Neither nobility nor wealth saved them from Roman pragmatism. Gaul's high society ceased to exist forever at the walls of Alesia, and for tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers, the real nightmare was just beginning. Sounds terrifying, doesn't it? Transporting 60,000 slaves from Gaul to Italy posed a colossal problem. You can't just tell a huge crowd of captives to head south. You need sturdy chains, reliable guards, tons of food, and a clear route. Roman merchants formed large syndicates to tackle these complex tasks. They hired armed bands of mercenaries to reinforce the convoys on dangerous stretches of the route. The captives were bound with special heavy wooden collars that were fastened around their necks. A massive iron chain stretched from one collar to the next. In this formation, the people were forced to move in perfect and unceasing unison. If one person stumbled and fell, he inevitably dragged the entire line down with him. Ancient engineers created a system that eliminated even the slightest chance of a successful escape. The mechanics of this control system were incredibly simple, cheap, and absolutely reliable. The march of slave columns across the Alps was a true test of survival. Autumn frosts killed hundreds of weakened captives every cold night. Roman guards never wasted their time burying the dead slaves. The bodies were simply dragged to the side of the road and left to wild animals. Traders factored a 30% loss rate into their business plans in advance. It was a cold, commercial calculation in which human life was measured by dry statistics. The pace of such a massive column was no more than 10 miles a day. Guards constantly drove the straggling captives forward with long leather whips. Food on the road consisted solely of a handful of stale grain and questionable water. As in any closed population bubble, the evolutionary selection of pathogens occurred at lightning speed. Dysentery killed the slaves far more often than the cruelty of the Roman overseers themselves. During rest stops, the escort set up temporary pens, very similar to those used for livestock. People were herded into a tight cluster so they could keep each other warm with their bodies. Guards with dogs, specially trained to track human scent, were stationed around the camp. Any attempt to break the chain at night was punished with immediate and excruciating death. Exemplary, brutal punishments were carried out early in the morning, in full view of the entire column. The Roman escorts were well versed in the art of visual and bloody discipline. The main transit point on this dreadful journey was the city of Narbonne. Here, the vast masses of Gauls were methodically divided into smaller consignments. Professional appraisers worked in Narbonne, meticulously inspecting the quality of the slaves. They examined their teeth, checked their joints, and assessed the captives' overall muscle mass. This humiliating procedure was no different from buying a horse or a work cow. Merchants branded the strongest slaves on the forehead or shoulder with a red-hot iron. This ensured that the valuable merchandise would not be swapped out during further transport. The smell of scorched human skin hung over the city squares for days on end. Local residents regarded this as a normal cost of large-scale imperial business. Ancient society felt no moral qualms whatsoever about slavery. It was considered an entirely natural order of things in a world of the strong and the weak. From the ports of southern Gaul, slaves were loaded en masse onto special transport ships. People were packed into dark holds so tightly that they were physically unable to turn around. The sea crossing to the ports of Italy took several very grueling and terrifying days. In stormy weather, the heavy hatch covers were nailed shut to prevent panic. If a wooden ship began to sink, the living cargo was simply sent to the bottom along with the vessel. The merchant's insurance never covered the loss of their talking tools due to the wrath of the gods. Those who miraculously survived this terrifying journey arrived in Ostia or Puteoli. These bustling Italian ports were the main gateways to the markets of a vast empire. The slaves were thoroughly washed of dirt, shaved bald, and generously rubbed with cheap olive oil. The merchandise had to look as presentable as possible to discerning Roman buyers. Merchants invested mere pennies in pre-sale preparation to maximize their final profit. Huge groups of Gallic warriors were displayed on tall wooden platforms in city squares. Special tags were hung around their necks, indicating their age, nationality, and useful skills. Wealthy owners of latifundia, mine managers, and owners of gladiator schools gathered around. The bidding proceeded quickly, incredibly loudly, and with frenzied financial excitement. But there is one important factor that turned the entire economy of that time upside down. The arrival of tens of thousands of captives after the fall of Alesia triggered a veritable economic tsunami. Imagine if 1 million completely free apartments were suddenly dumped onto the modern real estate market. Housing prices would inevitably collapse within a few days of panic. This is exactly what happened to the vast slave market in the Roman Republic. In the fall of 52 BC, supply so radically exceeded demand that the financial system simply collapsed. Before the Gallic War, a healthy adult slave cost about 2,000 silver sesterces. This was a very substantial sum, equal to the annual salary of a skilled craftsman, but Caesar sent such a colossal flood of live cargo to Italy that the markets were literally overwhelmed. The price of a strong Gallic man plummeted to a paltry 500 sesterces. In some border regions, slaves were easily traded for a single jug of cheap wine. The ancient economy experienced its first officially documented crisis of overproduction. Wealthy senators and shrewd businessmen rushed en masse to buy up the now cheap labor. Owners of agricultural estates began replacing free tenants with slaves who worked for free and had no rights. A slave demanded no wages, could not take legal action, and worked until his physical death. The initial investment paid for itself in just one successful harvest season on the plantations. It was an incredibly profitable model that forever changed the landscape of Italian agriculture. But this led to catastrophic consequences for ordinary, free Roman citizens. Ordinary peasants simply could not compete with the free slave labor of the Gauls, who went bankrupt en masse, lost their ancestral lands, and, in desperation, fled to Rome. The capital quickly filled with hundreds of thousands of unemployed, angry, and perpetually hungry proletarians. Rome's narrow streets turned into a veritable powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark. Your modern corporate restructuring is nothing compared to this massive social upheaval. Caesar himself fully understood all the global macroeconomic consequences of his harsh actions. The colossal sums of money from the wholesale sale of slaves flowed in a continuous stream into his personal treasury. He quickly paid off his enormous debts to Roman creditors, down to the very last sestes. Then the general began to aggressively, and on a massive scale, buy political influence within the Senate itself. He generously paid off the debts of influential politicians, turning them into his obedient puppets. Gold proved to be a far more effective and fearsome weapon than the swords of his legionaries. Part of this enormous profit went toward unprecedented financial payments to ordinary soldiers. Caesar officially doubled the base pay of his legionaries right there in the field camp. He constantly handed out generous bonuses to experienced centurions and mid-level army officers. The army quickly realized that their general was not only winning battles, but also making them fabulously wealthy. The loyalty of the veteran troops to Gaius Julius became absolutely fanatical and unshakable. The vast remaining funds were used for the large-scale and systematic bribery of the Roman plebs. Caesar personally financed the construction of new, grandiose public buildings in the capital of the Republic. He regularly organized free distributions of high-quality grain and expensive olive oil. At his own expense, he staged the most lavish and bloodiest gladiatorial games in the city's history. The crowd sincerely idolized the man who so generously shared his Gallic blood gold with them. The commander's popularity soared to the heavens, terrifying the conservative and elderly senators. The massive influx of slaves also triggered an unprecedented boom in the empire's construction industry. Cheap labor allowed Roman engineers to carry out absolutely fantastic infrastructure projects. Aqueducts, new paved roads, and deep-water ports were built in incredibly record-breaking time. The hard physical labor of the Gallic captives literally laid the stone foundation for imperial logistics. Modern megaprojects require sophisticated technology, but Rome simply relied on the muscle power of the conquered peoples. But this shining coin also had a very frightening dark side. The concentration of hundreds of thousands of embittered Gauls in Italy itself posed a constant threat of rebellion. The Romans remembered all too well and vividly the recent bloody war with Spartacus's army. Therefore, slave owners immediately imposed draconian security measures on their wealthy estates. At night, the captives were firmly chained and locked away in deep underground ergastula. Fear of their own living property became a constant and nerve-wracking companion for the Roman elite. The siege of Alesia transformed from a purely military operation into a massive economic lever. The lives of 80,000 Gauls were methodically converted into power, political influence, and monumental architecture. Caesar monetized his brilliant victory with the terrifying efficiency of a professional stockbroker. He coolly bought himself a loyal army, the love of the people, and the loyalty of corrupt politicians. No, this is not an exaggeration by ancient historians. Just think about the scale of these events. How did the Romans manage to maintain control over such a vast number of enemies who hated them? The secret lay in the psychology of fear, which was elevated to the status of official military doctrine. The legions did not merely terrify the enemy with their gleaming armor and thunderous battle cries. They demonstrated the absolute, cold, and terrifyingly mechanical inevitability of any punishment. For years, centurions trained soldiers to suppress all human emotions while carrying out their commander's orders. The Roman military theorist Flavius Vigitius Renatus later described this phenomenon in detail. He argued that the Roman army always won, not through bravery, but through its habit of strict discipline. A soldier should fear his centurion's oak staff far more than the enemy's sword. At the camp near Alesia, this brutal system functioned like a flawless and reliable clock. The legionaries patrolled the perimeter with stony faces, showing absolutely no reaction to the Gauls' insults. Their eerie calm shattered the prisoners' fighting spirit more effectively than any sophisticated form of torture. The morning in the Roman military camp began with a ritual designed to completely eradicate individuality. Thousands of men, in perfect unison, polished their armor, checked their leather straps, and sharpened their gladiuses. The sound of the buccinator's copper tube issued commands that every soldier understood without a word. This perfect group synchronization drastically reduced anxiety levels in the face of a potentially grueling battle. Modern evolutionary biology calls this an adaptive mechanism for reducing stress within a group. The Romans simply knew that a soldier busy with his duties thinks nothing at all about death. During a long siege, night watch duty was the most terrifying and exhausting ordeal. Guarding a crowd of thousands of desperate people in complete darkness is physically incredibly difficult. A sentry who fell asleep at his post was immediately sentenced to be stoned to death by his own comrades. This cruel law was called the Fusterium, and commanders enforced it without the slightest exception. Legate Titus Labienus personally and very strictly ensured the precise enforcement of this bloody code. The threat of a torturous death at the hands of their closest friends kept the soldiers on high alert. To prevent the legionaries from going mad with stress, the command constantly rotated their duties. Today, a unit would stand guard on the wall. Tomorrow, it would dig a deep trench, and the day after tomorrow, it would chop wood. This continuous rotation prevented the soldiers from becoming fixated on the daunting monotony of siege duty. In modern management, this is called effective prevention of employee burnout. Ancient officers intuitively understood the critical importance of varying activities to preserve mental well-being. The legionnaires' attitude toward the captured Gauls was purely and strictly utilitarian. For the classical Roman, a barbarian was never a human being in the full sense of the word. He was simply a dangerous but highly useful entity that required very harsh treatment. The soldiers felt neither sadistic pleasure nor the slightest pity for the starving Celts. They simply did their job well, like an experienced butcher in a large slaughterhouse. This chilling, clinical professionalism frightened the Gauls more than anything else in the world. Caesar himself often made personal rounds of the night watches to maintain high morale. He knew every centurion primipillus by face and addressed them exclusively by name. For a simple, weary soldier, the attention of the legendary general was the highest honor. This created a very powerful illusion of a familial bond between the supreme commander and the rank-and-file soldier. The commander was incredibly skilled at playing on the soldier's vanity and sincere loyalty. Roman weapons, too, were designed for methodical and mass destruction, not for heroics. The short gladius sword was intended exclusively for quick thrusts in close formation. Legionnaires were trained at length to strike from behind their large scutum shield directly at the enemy's exposed abdomen. No wide, sweeping motions, no beautiful, cinematic swordplay. 2 short steps forward, a sharp thrust, a step back, and so on, ad infinitum. This lethal combat ergonomics perfectly conserved energy for very long battles. When the captured Gauls looked fearfully at the Roman formation, they saw a monolithic wall, red tunics, gleaming bronze helmets, and even rows of spears merged into a single mechanism. Celtic military culture had always celebrated individual feats and the personal glory of each warrior. The Roman machine, however, ruthlessly ground down individuality for the sake of the survival of the entire vast system. The clash of these two utterly different philosophies led to the inevitable catastrophe at Alesia. A system of iron discipline, harsh punishments, and routine made the Roman army virtually invincible. Soldiers clung tightly to the ranks because certain death awaited them outside them, and it was precisely this soulless military machine that sealed the fate of those who found themselves outside the fortress. But there was one enormous group of people whose fate turned out to be far worse than slavery. Let's return to that horrific moment when Vercingetorix cold-bloodedly expelled the civilians. Tens of thousands of elderly people, women and children from the Mandabi tribe found themselves trapped between the high walls. They slowly died of exhaustion in a neutral zone just a few hundred meters wide. This is one of the darkest and most carefully suppressed chapters in all of world history. War always and inevitably takes its most terrible toll on those who do not bear arms. Roman sentries listened day and night to the cries of children and desperate pleas for help. Mothers held up their emaciated children, begging the legionnaires to give them at least a few crumbs of bread. But Caesar's cruel order remained unyielding. Not a single person was to be allowed beyond the line. Soldiers were strictly forbidden to throw any food beyond the palisade on pain of death. Military discipline suppressed basic human compassion with truly terrifying efficiency. Roman order always took precedence over any abstract morality. The Gallic warriors on the wooden walls of Alesia were also physically unable to help their loved ones. Their own meager food supplies had long since reached a critical and life-threatening threshold. Throwing food down meant inevitably hastening the surrender of the entire defending army, numbering in the thousands. The men were forced to watch in silence as their families wasted away right before their eyes. It was a veritable psychological hell, created by the cold calculation of the Roman commander. Why did Caesar make such an inhumane and utterly cruel military decision? He cynically calculated that the starving civilians would quickly break the fighting spirit of the stubborn defenders. Moreover, he was absolutely unwilling to waste his precious supplies on useless mouths to feed. The logistics of the besieging Roman army were already operating at the very limit of their physical capacity. Every sack of wheat was of strategic value for the survival of the legions themselves. Empathy in war is always considered an impermissible and dangerous luxury for a commander-in-chief. Some ancient authors, such as Cassius Dio, mentioned this horrific episode only in passing. In pragmatic Roman society, the mass death of barbarians was never considered a true tragedy. For the Senate, it was simply a dry statistic of inevitable collateral military losses. No one wrote beautiful poems or erected marble monuments to the fallen civilian Mandabians. History is always written by the victors, and the Roman victors had absolutely no need for uncomfortable memories. Modern archaeologists still regularly discover mass graves around the hill of Alesia. The bones of women and small children lie intermingled with rusty Roman arrowheads. Analysis of these remains reveals an extreme degree of physical exhaustion prior to death. Science conclusively confirms what the emperor's grandiose triumphal inscriptions tactfully omitted. The siege became a massive and flawless mechanism for the extermination of the civilian population. Scholars dryly refer to this as an inevitable side effect of total war. At night, when the air temperature dropped sharply, the mortality rate among civilians rose catastrophically. People huddled together in very tight groups, desperately trying to preserve what little heat remained. In the morning, patrolling legionnaires saw dozens of new, motionless bodies on the cold, frozen ground. The sweetish smell of decay began to rapidly poison the air along the entire multi-mile line of fortifications. This posed a very real threat of an epidemic to the besieging Roman troops themselves. The soldiers had to periodically burn the corpses to avoid an inevitable outbreak of dangerous diseases. Thick smoke from these funeral pyres hung constantly like a black cloud over the picturesque valley. This gruesome sanitary procedure was always carried out with typical and frightening Roman methodical precision. Special burial teams of legionnaires worked wearing leather masks heavily soaked in acetic acid. The machinery of war did not stop for a single minute, methodically erasing the traces of its crimes. Even mass death was organized according to strict and impeccable military regulations. By the time of Vercingetorix's long-awaited surrender, not a single Mandabian was left alive. The neutral zone had been completely transformed into a vast field of unburied human remains. The Gallic warriors finally surrendered, not only because of their own unbearable hunger. They surrendered because they could no longer endure this horrifying daily spectacle. Their will to resist was finally crushed by the sight of their own dead families. This tragedy became the key to understanding the true cost of Roman imperial power. The empire was built not only on ingenious stone engineering and strict military discipline. It was built on a fundamental willingness to overlook absolutely any human sacrifice. Caesar achieved his goals at any possible cost, and that final cost was monstrous. And this is where the most interesting part of Rome's entire subsequent history begins. We have now reached the main and most paradoxical historical conclusion of our story. Alesia did not merely bring to a close the bloody conquest of vast and wild barbarian Gaul. It became the most powerful financial catalyst for the destruction of the ancient Roman Republic itself. Without those 80,000 sold Gauls, world history would almost certainly have taken a different course. Let's trace this astonishing chain of causes and inevitable bloody consequences. As we have already established, Caesar earned absolutely astronomical sums from the sale of slaves. This ill-gotten money made him the wealthiest and most independent politician in all of Rome. Predictably, the Senate was terrified of his growing power and demanded that he immediately disband his loyal legions. The conservatives, led by Pompey the Great, planned to destroy Julius both politically and physically, but they fatally underestimated the level of loyalty these battle-hardened troops felt toward their generous commander. The army, having received Gallic gold, was ready to follow him absolutely anywhere. In 49 BC, Caesar approached the northern border of Italy itself. The small Rubicon River separated his province from the sovereign territory of the greatest republic. By law, a general with an armed army had no right to cross this line. But the legions, hardened at the walls of Alesia, were no longer afraid to violate the ancient laws of the Senate. The soldiers were accustomed to constant victory and placed complete trust in their commander's political intuition. Caesar cast the historic die and issued the fateful order to cross the river. A brutal and protracted civil war began, engulfing the entire vast Mediterranean region. And this massive war had to be financed very generously and continuously with cash. Chartering ships, purchasing grain, and manufacturing weapons required truly colossal expenditures. The capital amassed through the wholesale sale of Gallic captives fully funded this military campaign. The slaves of Alesia effectively and literally paid for the dictator's march on defenseless Rome. Veterans of the Gallic War quickly became the core of the future dictator's new, highly professional army. Centurions, accustomed to the harsh discipline of siege camps, boldly led the recruits into battle. They coolly applied tactics of rotation and attrition against their own compatriots. The experience gained during the construction of the double ring of fortifications was successfully applied throughout Europe. Gaul became an ideal and bloody training ground for the future invincible imperial troops. Throughout this turbulent period, Vercingetorix continued to sit silently in his underground prison. He was a living, suffering witness to how the world around him was changing forever. In 46 BC, Caesar finally celebrated his grand quadruple triumph. The aged and exhausted Gallic chieftain, in chains, was paraded through the streets of the jubilant capital. Immediately after the lavish ceremony, he was quietly strangled in a dark cell on the dictator's orders. The final chapter in the proud king's journey was sealed by the rough rope of a Roman executioner. Caesar's triumph was a display of unprecedented luxury and absolute imperial power. Tons of gold, silver, and precious trophy weapons were laboriously hauled through the streets. Thousands of hand-picked Gallic slaves walked submissively behind the great victor's chariot. The Romans sincerely marveled at the scale of the victory, completely unaware of the looming political catastrophe. The Republic died forever at the very moment the crowd joyfully hailed its usurper. The siege of Alesia perfectly illustrates the true nature of the entire ancient historical era. It was a brutal era where ingenious engineering went hand in hand with mass murder, where the fate of an entire vast people could be decided by precise mathematical calculation. A system built on slavery and conquest functioned flawlessly and with utter ruthlessness. The modern civilized world has in many ways grown out of this bloody and cold pragmatism. We still use Roman law today and sincerely admire their straight roads. But we rarely stop to think about who exactly built these roads. They are paved with the bones of tens of thousands of nameless and wretched captives from Gaul. They were generously paid for with the tears of the Mandabians and the profound humiliation of the defeated Celtic aristocracy. History always loves to remember the illustrious names of the victors and their great battles. but it very quickly and willingly forgets the terrible logistics of human suffering. 52 BC, the September wind still carries the smell of smoke over the fortifications. Vercingetorix throws his sword resignedly at the feet of the Roman commander, who sits in silence. Caesar looks at him intently and sees more than just a defeated enemy. He clearly sees gold coins, new legions, and his future absolute power. At that moment, the fate of 80,000 people forever and irrevocably changed our world.